I never figured that shoveling snow for my neighbors would lead to a full-blown war. But that's exactly what happened. It all started with a blizzard and ended with a pair of handcuffs. And in between, I learned more than I ever wanted to know about homeowners associations, petty tyrants, and the sweet, sweet satisfaction of justice. For 15 years, I'd lived a quiet life in Oakwood Creek Estates, a neighborhood that was less a formal subdivision and more a collection of houses on big wooded lots that happened to share a road and a community well. My business, Oakwood Services, was my life's work. I did landscaping, lawn care, and general property maintenance in the summer, and when the snows came, I switched over to plowing and removal. It was a good, honest living, and it kept me connected to the people in my community. The neighborhood itself had always been the best part of living here. It was a live and let live kind of place. We had an HOA, technically, but for most of my time here, it was a benign entity. Its sole purpose was to collect a couple $100s a year from each of the 40 households to cover road grading, plowing the main access road, and maintaining the pump for the community well. The meetings were held once a year, lasted about 20 minutes, and were mostly an excuse for Mr. Henderson from down the lane to tell the same joke about a squirrel and a power line. Nobody cared what color your mailbox was or if you left your trash cans out an extra hour. We were neighbors, not wardens. That all changed about 2 years ago when Brenda moved in. She and her quiet, perpetually nervous-looking husband Stan bought the old Miller place at the entrance to the neighborhood. From day one, Brenda carried herself with an air of unearned authority. She'd come from some gated community in the city, she was fond of telling everyone, a place with standards. She joined the HOA board at her very first meeting, citing her extensive experience in community management. The existing board, made up of folks like Mr. Henderson who just wanted to get back to their gardening, were happy to have someone so seemingly enthusiastic take the reins. Within a year, through a combination of relentless campaigning and the sheer exhaustion of everyone else, she was elected president. The changes started small, like a dripping faucet that you try to ignore. First came the newsletter, a glossy 4-page affair that showed up in our mailboxes every month, filled with passive-aggressive reminders about community aesthetics. Then came the new rules, a regulation dictating that all mailboxes had to be a specific model of black, powder-coated steel, purchased through an approved vendor. A rule about lawn ornaments, specifying that only 2 were allowed per property, and neither could exceed 24 inches in height. My collection of 7 garden gnomes, a gift from my niece, was suddenly in violation. People grumbled, but it was easier to buy a new mailbox or hide a gnome than to fight. Brenda had an answer for everything, usually a condescending speech about protecting our property values that made you feel like a slob for even questioning her. She was a master of making reason sound like rebellion. I mostly kept my head down. My lot was at the far end of the development, nicely secluded, and my work kept me busy. I swapped out my mailbox, moved 5 of my gnomes to the back patio, and figured that was the end of it. I even inherited my grandfather's old hunting cabin up in the mountains around that time. It was a rustic, off-grid place about a 90-minute drive away, a place full of memories. It was a welcome distraction, a reminder of a simpler world where the only rules were dictated by the seasons. I didn't get up there much, but just knowing it was there, a quiet escape from the creeping suburban tyranny, was a comfort. I had no idea then how important that dusty old cabin would become. The inciting incident, the spark that lit the fuse on the whole powder keg, arrived in the form of a blizzard. It wasn't just a snowstorm, it was a meteorological event of historic proportions, the kind they give dramatic names on the news. They called it Snowmageddon, and for once, the hyperbole was justified. Over 30 inches of heavy, wet snow fell in less than 24 hours. The world outside my window turned into a silent, white wilderness. The county plows were overwhelmed, the state of emergency was declared, and everyone was told to stay home. For me, a storm like this was go time. My Ford F350, with its heavy-duty plow and the skid steer I kept for big jobs, were more than just tools of my trade. They were my contribution to the neighborhood. As soon as the snow tapered off, I fired up the truck. I cleared my own long driveway first, then I did what I always did. I drove down to Mr. Henderson's place. He was in his 80s and had a heart condition, and the idea of him trying to shovel that mountain of snow was a non-starter. I cleared his driveway and a path to his door. Next, I did the Miller's place. They had 2 kids under 5, and I knew they'd be going stir-crazy. After that, I started on the main access road that wound through Oakwood Creek. The HOA's contracted plow service, a new company from 2 towns over that Brenda had hired, was nowhere to be seen. I knew people needed to be able to get out for emergencies, so I spent the next 3 hours carving a single, passable lane through the whole development. It wasn't pretty, but it was functional. It was neighborly. I was back in my kitchen the next morning, nursing a hot cup of coffee and enjoying the feeling of a job well done, when I saw her. A figure in a bright pink parka, marching up my freshly plowed driveway like a soldier on a mission. It was Brenda. I sighed and opened the door before she could start pounding on it. She didn't bother with a greeting. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Her face was pinched with fury, little clouds of her breath puffing out in the frigid air. "Good morning to you too, Brenda," I said calmly. "I was just having some coffee. You want one?" "Do not be glib with me, Jack," she snapped, brandishing a leather-bound binder like a weapon. It was the HOA rulebook, her holy text. "You are in direct violation of multiple community bylaws." She flipped to a tabbed page. Article 7, Section 4, Paragraph B. No resident shall engage in commercial-grade landscaping or earth-moving activities on common property without prior written approval from the board and proof of supplementary liability insurance. I blinked. "Brenda, I was plowing the road so people wouldn't be trapped. It was an emergency. Your plow service never showed up." "The service was delayed due to the unprecedented nature of the storm," she recited, as if reading from a script. "Your unauthorized actions constitute running a private, unlicensed business on HOA property." Furthermore, she flipped to another page. Article 9, Section 2, Paragraph C. All snow removed from roadways must be deposited in designated catchment areas and graded to a uniform, aesthetically pleasing slope, not to exceed 3 feet in height. She gestured dramatically at the snowbank along the side of the road. "That is clearly over 3 feet. It's an eyesore and a liability." I stared at her, then at the snowbank, then back at her. The sheer, unadulterated absurdity of it was breathtaking. We were in the middle of a natural disaster, and she was quoting rules about the aesthetic uniformity of snow piles. "You can't be serious," I said, the words coming out slower than I intended. "I am always serious when it comes to the integrity of our community," she said, her eyes glinting with self-righteous fire. "You will receive a formal notice of violation. There will be an initial fine of $500 for the unauthorized commercial activity. You will then be fined an additional $100 per day until those non-compliant snow piles are removed or brought into compliance." She snapped the binder shut. "Have a nice day." She turned on her heel and marched back down the driveway, a triumphant pink warrior who had just defended the neighborhood from the grave threat of helpfulness. I stood in my doorway, the cold air seeping into the house, and I knew this was no longer about garden gnomes. This was a declaration of war. My first instinct was to laugh it off. A fine for helping my neighbors? A penalty for the shape of a snowbank during a blizzard? It had to be a joke, a power trip that would evaporate once she came to her senses. I tossed the official-looking letter that arrived a few days later onto the pile of junk mail on my counter. The letter, printed on heavy cream-colored paper with the HOA's embossed logo, detailed my infractions in florid legalese and demanded payment of $500 within 30 days. I ignored it. That was my first mistake. A week later, another letter arrived. This one informed me that since the non-compliant snow piles had not been remediated, I had incurred an additional $700 in daily fines. The total was now $1,200. The letter was colder, more threatening. It mentioned further legal action. This was followed by another fine, this time for $250. The violation? My work truck, the one with the plow still attached, had been parked in my own driveway for more than 48 consecutive hours. This was a new interpretation of an old, vague rule about commercial vehicles, a rule that had never been enforced in the 15 years I'd lived there. It was clear this was no longer just about the snow. It was personal. The community, meanwhile, was starting to feel the effects of Brenda's rain. The out-of-town snow removal company she'd hired finally did show up, 2 days late. They were expensive and incompetent. Their drivers, unfamiliar with the layout of our winding roads, scraped up lawns, knocked over 2 mailboxes, including one of the new, mandatory black ones, and plowed several people in, creating berms of ice and snow at the end of their driveways that were nearly impossible to break through. Mr. Henderson's visiting nurse couldn't get to his house for her scheduled appointment, and he missed a crucial checkup. The mail carrier, faced with a haphazardly cleared road and blocked mailboxes, skipped our entire development for 2 days straight. People were furious. The neighborhood's online message board, once a sleepy place for announcing garage sales, lit up with complaints. But when anyone confronted Brenda, she had a ready-made excuse. The problems were a direct result of Jack's initial interference, which had disrupted the contractor's optimized clearing pattern. She was a master of corporate doublespeak, deflecting blame and twisting reality until your head spun. A few people tried to speak to the other board members, but 2 of them were Brenda's hand-picked cronies who parroted her every word, and the third, a timid woman named Carol, seemed too terrified of Brenda to even make eye contact. The message was clear. Brenda was in charge, and her power was absolute. The final straw for me came in a certified letter. It was a notice of intent to file lien. The total of my unpaid fines, which I still considered to be completely illegitimate, had now ballooned to over $3,000. The HOA, through its high-priced law firm, was threatening to place a lien on my property. That meant I couldn't sell my house, couldn't refinance, couldn't do anything until this black mark was cleared. My home, the place I had worked my entire adult life to own, was being held hostage over the shape of a snowbank. The casual absurdity had curdled into a genuine threat. My quiet life was officially over. I knew I was out of my depth. This wasn't a disagreement between neighbors anymore. It was a legal battle. I called a guy I knew who had gone through a nasty divorce and asked for his lawyer's name. He pointed me to David Chen, a lawyer in the next town over who specialized in real estate and property law. David was a young, sharp-as-a-tack guy who listened to my whole story with an expression that shifted from mild amusement to serious concern. "An HOA is a private government, Jack," he explained, leaning back in his leather chair. "And a bad one can be a petty dictatorship. They can fine you, they can put a lien on your house, and in extreme cases, they can even foreclose. Fighting them can be a long, expensive nightmare." He paused, looking at the stack of violation notices I'd brought with me. "However," he said, a glint in his eye, "what you're describing, this is beyond the pale. Fining you for helping people in an emergency? That's not just petty, it's egregious. I think a judge would find it highly unreasonable." David laid out a plan. First, we would formally dispute the fines and the lien. Second, and more importantly, he told me to go on the offensive. "These little tyrants thrive in the dark," he said. "They count on people being too tired or too intimidated to look closely. We need to shine a very bright light on Brenda and her entire operation." He instructed me to use my rights as a homeowner to request every piece of documentation I was entitled to, minutes from every board meeting for the past 2 years, detailed financial statements, budgets, and copies of all contracts the HOA had signed. "Look for procedural errors," David advised. Did they follow their own rules for holding meetings? For passing new regulations? For awarding contracts? Look for financial oddities. Where is all this money going? You said the fees went up and the service got worse. That's a red flag. The lawyer's words armed me with something I hadn't had before, a strategy. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was an investigator. The investigation became my obsession. I spent my evenings poring over stacks of paper instead of watching television. The meeting minutes were a revelation. They were poorly kept, often missing key details, but they showed a clear pattern. Every proposal by Brenda was passed unanimously by her 2 cronies, with Carol, the third member, always marked as abstained. The new rules about mailboxes and lawn ornaments had been passed without the required 30-day notice period for homeowner comment. That was a procedural error, a small victory. Then I got to the financials and things got really interesting. As I suspected, the budget had skyrocketed since Brenda took over. The line item for common area maintenance, which covered landscaping and snow removal, had nearly tripled. I looked at the contracts. The landscaping company, Evergreen Prestige Services, and the snow removal company, Pristine Plowing, were both based out of the same address 2 towns over. I'd never heard of either of them, which was strange in my line of work. I ran a search on the state's business registry. Evergreen Prestige Services was registered to a Stanley Kowalski. Pristine Plowing was also registered to a Stanley Kowalski. Stan, Brenda's quiet, nervous husband. My heart started pounding. This was more than just bad management. This was corruption. Brenda was using her position as HOA president to funnel our dues directly into her husband's pocket through his shell companies. The inflated contracts, the terrible service, it all made sense. She wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was a crook. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the weapon I needed. But as powerful as this discovery was, the universe was about to hand me something even better. Something so perfect and so poetically just that I couldn't have invented it if I tried. The catalyst for the true turning point came from a completely unexpected place. While gathering documents for David, he asked for the deeds to all properties I owned, just as a matter of due diligence. I had the deed for my house, of course, but then I remembered the cabin. I dug through the old metal box where my grandfather had kept his important papers. It was a mess of birth certificates, Army discharge papers, and old stock certificates. Tucked in the back was a folder labeled The Roost, his name for the hunting cabin. Inside was the deed, and sitting right on top of it was the most recent property tax bill. It was due in 2 weeks. A wave of guilt washed over me. With all the chaos from Brenda and the HOA, I hadn't even thought about the cabin in months. I hadn't been up there since the previous fall. I decided then and there to take a weekend. I needed to check on the place, make sure a winter storm hadn't brought a tree down on the roof, and just clear my head. I told David I'd drop the deed off on Monday and headed north on Saturday morning, feeling a sense of relief at just leaving Oakwood Creek behind for a couple of days. The drive up was beautiful, the roads finally clear, the trees heavy with clinging snow. The cabin was located down a long, unpaved Forest Service road. As I made the final turn onto the dirt track that led to the property, something felt off. There were fresh tire tracks in the snow. That was unusual. No one ever came down this road except me. I figured it was probably just some kids in a 4x4, but a knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I pulled my truck up to the small clearing where the cabin stood. And I stopped. The scene in front of me was all wrong. The old rusted padlock I always used on the front door was gone. In its place was a new, shiny brass lock. A thin plume of gray smoke was curling from the stone chimney, and mounted on the roof, a jarringly modern intrusion on the rustic log structure, was a satellite dish. My grandfather's off-grid sanctuary had television. My first thought was that I had taken a wrong turn, that this wasn't my cabin. But it was. There was the big gnarled oak tree where I'd built a terrible treehouse as a kid, the woodpile I'd stacked myself last October. This was my place. Someone was in my cabin. I killed the engine and got out of the truck as quietly as I could, my heart hammering against my ribs. I crept toward the side of the cabin, staying low, and peered into the main window. The interior was different. There were new curtains on the windows, a floral patterned rug on the floor, and framed pictures on the mantelpiece where my grandfather's hunting trophies used to hang. And sitting there, on my grandfather's worn leather armchair, was Stan, Brenda's husband. He was watching a basketball game on a flat-screen television, and then, from the small kitchen area, Brenda herself emerged, carrying 2 mugs of what looked like hot chocolate. She handed one to Stan, sat on the arm of his chair, and said something that made him laugh. They looked perfectly at home. They looked like they owned the place. A white-hot rage, pure and more intense than anything I had ever felt, surged through me. My immediate instinct was to kick the door in, to drag them out into the snow, to scream at them until my throat was raw. They hadn't just trespassed, they had violated a place that was sacred to me, a place filled with memories of my grandfather. They had made themselves comfortable in my history. But then, another thought, cold and sharp, cut through the anger. It was David's voice in my head. These little tyrants thrive in the dark. Confronting them now would just be a shouting match. They would lie, they would deny, they would twist it somehow. I had them cold. But raw anger wasn't a strategy. This required something more. This required a plan. I backed away from the window as silently as I had approached. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clearer than it had been in months. I got my phone out and took pictures. Pictures of the new lock. Pictures of their car, a late-model Lexus, parked behind the cabin. Pictures through the window of them sitting there, watching television. Then I turned on the audio recorder on my phone, crept back to the window, and held it as close to the glass as I dared. I couldn't hear much, just the murmur of their voices and the television. But then Brenda's voice came through, clear as a bell. She was laughing. "I swear, Stan," she said, "that idiot grandson will never even notice. His grandfather is dead and gone, and from what I hear, the kid is too busy fighting with the HOA to care about some dusty old shack in the woods." That was it. That was everything. I saved the recording, my fingers numb. I backed away, got in my truck, and drove. I didn't drive home. I drove straight to David Chen's office. It was a Saturday, but I called his cell and told him it was an emergency. He met me there 20 minutes later, his weekend plans forgotten. I laid it all out on his conference table. The photos, the audio file, the story. He listened, his eyes getting wider and wider. When I was finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he leaned back and let out a low whistle. "Jack," he said, a slow grin spreading across his face. "This is it. This is the whole ballgame. Embezzlement is one thing. That's a white-collar crime. This is personal. This is theatrical. Breaking and entering, squatting, theft of property, and the sheer, glorious arrogance of it all." He started pacing his office, energized. "We don't just have a legal case anymore. We have a public execution." The strategy shifted instantly. We were no longer on the defensive, trying to fend off fines. We were on the attack. The plan David devised was simple, brutal, and beautiful. Brenda had called an emergency HOA meeting for the following Wednesday. The official agenda item was to discuss and vote on foreclosure proceedings for a delinquent account. My account. She was planning to publicly humiliate me and authorize the seizure of my home. She had no idea that she was actually arranging her own downfall. David told me exactly what to do. I spent Monday morning with a locksmith. On Tuesday, I filed a formal police report in the county where the cabin was located. And on Wednesday evening, I put on my best shirt, took a deep breath, and walked into the community clubhouse, ready for the show. The community clubhouse, a modest building normally used for potlucks and children's birthday parties, was packed. Every single one of the 40 households was represented, a testament to the level of discontent Brenda had managed to sow. The air was thick with tension and resentment. People who normally just nodded at each other were gathered in small murmuring groups, their faces grim. They were here to see a spectacle, and they were about to get one, just not the one they were expecting. I walked in with David at my side. A few people gave me sympathetic looks. Mr. Henderson caught my eye and gave me a firm, encouraging nod. I saw the Millers, who shot me a small, worried smile. They were all on my side, but they felt powerless. Brenda was at a long table at the front of the room, flanked by her 2 loyal board members. She was in her element, radiating a smug, righteous authority. She looked up as I entered, and a flicker of triumphant malice crossed her face. She thought she had me. She thought this was her victory lap. Brenda banged a small gavel on the table. This emergency meeting of the Oakwood Creek Estates Homeowners Association is now in session, she announced, her voice ringing with phony importance. She launched into a prepared speech, a long, rambling tirade about the sacred duty of the HOA to uphold community standards and protect property values. She spoke about the cancer of non-compliance and the need to excise it before it spreads. She never used my name, referring to me only as the delinquent homeowner or the individual in question, but her eyes kept flicking toward me. She was savoring this. She painted me as a rogue element, a troublemaker who threatened the very fabric of their peaceful existence. Finally, she got to the point. "The board has exhausted all other options," she declared, her voice dripping with false regret. "Therefore, I move that the association authorize our legal counsel to immediately initiate foreclosure proceedings on the property at 42 Juniper Lane due to continued and flagrant non-payment of fines and fees totaling $4,200. Her crony, a man named Gary, immediately seconded the motion. "All in favor?" Brenda asked, looking out at the crowd, a queen demanding fealty. Before anyone could respond, David stood up. "Point of order, Madam President," he said, his voice calm and professional. Brenda glared at him. "This is not a public debate, Council. This is a board vote." "According to your own bylaws," David replied smoothly, holding up a copy of the HOA rulebook. Article 3, Section 8. "The homeowner in question has the right to address the board before such a vote is taken. We invoke that right." Brenda's face tightened. She was trapped by her own precious rules. "Fine," she snapped. "You have 5 minutes." I walked to the front of the room. I didn't look at the crowd. I looked directly at Brenda. I had a small remote in my hand for the projector David had quietly set up in the back while Brenda was pontificating. "Thank you, Madam President," I began, my voice steady. "I don't want to talk about the snow. I don't want to talk about the fines. I have a more pressing question for you." I paused, letting the silence hang in the room. "Brenda, how was your weekend? Did you have a nice, relaxing time up at the cabin?" A change came over her face. It was subtle at first, a flicker of confusion, but then a wave of stark, bone-white fear washed over her. Her smugness evaporated. Stan, sitting in the front row, went rigid. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. "Oh, I think you do," I said, my voice hardening. I clicked the remote. The first image flashed onto the screen behind her. It was a crystal-clear photo of my grandfather's cabin, with a shiny new brass lock on the door. A murmur went through the crowd. "I'm talking about my cabin," I said, my voice rising. "The one you broke into. The one you've been illegally squatting in. My grandfather's cabin." I clicked the remote again. A photo of her Lexus, parked behind the cabin. Click. A photo of her and Stan, visible through the window, lounging on the furniture. The murmurs in the room grew into gasps of shock. "This is ridiculous! It's a lie!" Brenda shrieked, jumping to her feet. Her face was a mask of panicked rage. "Is it?" I asked. "Then maybe you can explain this." I pressed another button, and the audio file began to play. My phone connected to the projector's speakers. Her voice, her smug, condescending voice, filled the room. "That idiot grandson will never even notice. His grandfather is dead and gone, and from what I hear, the kid is too busy fighting with the HOA to care about some dusty old shack in the woods." The room erupted. It was absolute pandemonium. People were on their feet, shouting, pointing. The color drained completely from Brenda's face. She looked like a ghost. Her loyal board members stared at her, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. The third board member, Carol, looked like she was about to faint. David stepped forward into the chaos. "That's quite enough," he boomed, his voice cutting through the noise. The room quieted slightly. "For the record," he announced, "a police report has already been filed for breaking and entering, criminal trespass, and theft of property. But that, unfortunately, is not all." He held up the thick binder of financial documents I had compiled. "We also have this." He walked to the table and handed the binder to Carol, the abstaining board member. "This binder contains conclusive proof that President Brenda Kowalski and her husband Stan Kowalski have been systematically embezzling funds from this community for the past 18 months. You'll find inflated invoices and records of payments made to two companies, Evergreen Prestige Services and Pristine Plowing. Both companies, you will find, are wholly owned by Mr. Stan Kowalski. You have been paying your president and her husband to do a terrible job of maintaining your neighborhood, all while she fined residents for ridiculous infractions. The revelation landed like a physical blow. The room was dead silent for a second, and then the rage came. A tidal wave of it. People were screaming "thief" and "crook." Stan looked like he was about to be physically ill. Brenda just stood there, swaying slightly, her face a blank canvas of utter ruin. And then, as if on cue, the double doors at the back of the clubhouse opened. Two uniformed sheriff's deputies walked in. They had been waiting in the parking lot, briefed by David ahead of time. They moved calmly through the stunned crowd, their expressions impassive. They walked right up to the front table. One deputy approached Brenda, the other approached Stan. "Brenda Kowalski," the first deputy said, his voice professional and clear. "You are under arrest for embezzlement and fraud. Stanley Kowalski, you are under arrest for conspiracy and receiving stolen property." The deputies cuffed them. The click of the metal ratchets was the loudest sound in the silent room. Brenda didn't resist. She seemed to have shrunk, all the fight and fury gone out of her, replaced by a hollow, vacant shock. As they led her past me, her eyes met mine for a fleeting second. There was no anger in them, no defiance. Just a vast, empty abyss of defeat. The sight of her, the petty tyrant who had made my life hell, being led away in handcuffs from a meeting she had called to destroy me, was the most profoundly satisfying moment of my life. The immediate aftermath of Brenda and Stan's arrest was chaotic, but it was a cathartic chaos. The emergency meeting dissolved as people poured out of the clubhouse, buzzing with the night's revelations. The story spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. My phone didn't stop ringing for 3 days. People I barely knew called to thank me, to apologize for not speaking up sooner, and to share their own stories of Brenda's petty bullying. It turned out my 7 garden gnomes were just the tip of the iceberg. She had fined one family because their basketball hoop was a shade of orange she deemed garish, and another because their wind chimes were excessively dissonant. The legal consequences for the Kowalskis were swift and severe. Faced with the mountain of evidence David and I had compiled, the bank records, the fraudulent invoices, the business registrations, not to mention the breaking and entering charges for the cabin, they had no room to maneuver. Their high-priced lawyer quickly advised them to take a plea deal. They pleaded guilty to multiple felonies, including embezzlement, wire fraud, and criminal trespass. Brenda was sentenced to 2 years in state prison, Stan to 18 months. They were also ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, a figure that amounted to nearly $80,000. The court placed a lien on their house, the very weapon they had tried to use against me, to ensure the debt was paid. My own vindication was just as swift. The remaining 2 board members, Brenda's cronies, resigned in disgrace the morning after the meeting. Carol, the timid one, was left to pick up the pieces. Her first official act as interim president was to call me personally. She was profusely apologetic, explaining how intimidated she had been by Brenda. I believed her. She immediately convened an emergency session, a proper one this time, and the board voted unanimously to drop all fines, fees, and legal actions against me. The lien that had been filed with the county was formally withdrawn the next day. A week later, a letter arrived at my house. It was from the new board, on plain white paper. It was a formal, written apology to me and to the entire community for the gross abuse of power and criminal misconduct of the previous administration. With Brenda's toxic influence gone, the neighborhood began to heal. It was like a cloud had lifted. People started talking to each other again. The oppressive atmosphere of surveillance and judgment was replaced by the old, familiar feeling of neighborly cooperation. A special election was held to form a new HOA board. I was nominated by at least a dozen people, but I politely declined. I was a plow guy, not a politician. I had no desire to sit in meetings, even friendly ones. I did, however, nominate Mr. Henderson. He was retired, respected by everyone, and possessed a deep well of common sense. He was elected unanimously. The new board's first order of business was a complete overhaul of the bylaws. They stripped out all of Brenda's ridiculous, aesthetic-based rules. The regulations on mailboxes, lawn ornaments, and trash can placement were all tossed onto the scrap heap of history. The new governing documents were simple and focused only on the essentials: road maintenance, the community well, and basic safety. The HOA was returned to its original benign purpose. In a move that brought me a quiet sense of satisfaction, the new board awarded the official contract for landscaping and snow removal to my company, Oakwood Services. The contract was for a fair market price, significantly less than what Brenda had been paying her husband, and the whole process was transparent. The neighborhood was finally getting good service for a fair price. A few weeks later, Mr. Henderson and the Millers organized a neighborhood-wide barbecue in my honor. It felt a little embarrassing, but it was also deeply gratifying. Standing there, flipping burgers and talking with my neighbors, I felt like I had my community back. Several years have passed since the Great HOA War. Oakwood Creek Estates is more peaceful and more united than it has ever been. The story of Brenda the Bonkers HOA president has become something of a local legend, a cautionary tale told to new residents about the dangers of letting a petty tyrant take control. Under Mr. Henderson's calm and reasonable leadership, the community has thrived. Our finances are healthy, the roads are always clear in the winter, and the lawns are green in the summer. Property values have indeed gone up, not because of uniform mailboxes, but because it's a genuinely great place to live, a place where neighbors look out for each other. I did see Brenda one last time. It was about a year ago. I was in the dairy aisle of the grocery store in the next town over, trying to decide between 2% and whole milk when I saw her. I almost didn't recognize her. The years had not been kind. Her hair was graying. The arrogant fire in her eyes was gone, replaced by a weary, defeated slump in her shoulders. She looked smaller, diminished. She saw me, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the old panic in her eyes. She started to turn away, but then she stopped. She walked over to me, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Jack," she said, her voice barely a whisper. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for everything." I looked at her, this woman who had tried to ruin my life over snowbanks and squat in my family's history. I had expected to feel a surge of anger or a jolt of satisfaction. Instead, I felt nothing but a quiet, detached pity. She wasn't a monster anymore. She was just a sad, broken person who had been consumed by her own bitterness and greed. "I appreciate that, Brenda," I said, and I meant it. I didn't need to forgive her because her actions no longer had any power over me. I just nodded, picked up my milk, and walked away. I never saw her again. Sometimes, when I'm out on a quiet night, I think about the whole absurd affair. It's funny how a desire to be left alone can force you into becoming a reluctant champion for your entire community. The whole mess taught me a valuable lesson. It taught me that the small tyrannies are often the most insidious because they grow in the soil of apathy. They take root when good people decide it's easier to comply than to complain. Easier to hide a garden gnome than to stand up and say, "This is ridiculous." Brenda's power wasn't in the rulebook, it was in our collective exhaustion. She counted on us being too busy or too tired to fight back. The ultimate irony, of course, is that her obsession with rules and order was just a smokescreen for her own lawlessness. While she was busy measuring the height of her neighbor's lawn ornaments, she was committing felonies. It's a classic playbook for bullies and despots everywhere. Create a public enemy and a set of rigid, arbitrary rules to distract everyone from what you're really doing in the shadows. She thought her power came from enforcing the letter of the law, but her downfall came because she so flagrantly violated its spirit, not to mention the actual criminal code. In the end, her own arrogance was the weapon I used against her. She built her own trap, and I just had the satisfaction of springing it. The snow is falling again tonight. It's the first real storm of the season, and the flakes are coming down thick and fast. In a few hours, I'll fire up the big Ford, the plow blade gleaming under the yard light. I'll clear my driveway, and then I'll head down the lane. I'll do Mr. Henderson's place first, then the Millers. Then I'll make a first pass down the main road, making sure everyone can get out if they need to. It's just what I do. I look out the window at the quiet houses of Oakwood Creek, lights glowing warmly in the windows, and a deep sense of peace settles over me. The war is long over. The quiet life I fought so hard to protect is here, all around me, blanketed in a fresh layer of silent, uniform, and beautifully non-compliant snow. And it's perfect.